Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you again to another interview on behalf of American Greatness Magazine. And this again is with another author. Last author was Gary Byrne, and you might have seen my first one with Stephen Jimenez, but this is Tyler O'Neill from PJ Media. And he has a book called Making Hate Pay: The Corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I can tell you personally, it wasn't the SPLC that got me onto this pattern with like a lot of these nonprofits, that they seem to just be a self-regenerating industry feeding on hate. It was the ADL, because I come from the Jewish community and they often claim to speak on behalf of us. You could certainly make the same case for a number of other nonprofits like GLAD or the NAACP. I guess the first question I had, you mentioned in Making Hate Pay that much of the early work of the SPLC was with indigent legal clients. Many of them were on risk of being put on death row in cases like Beck versus Alabama, which the SPLC won. But since refocusing on the Klan and then other hate groups, they're now advocating for harsher sentencing for hate crimes like they did in 2000 concerning the Hate Crime Prevention Act. Can you explain how that transition happened?
Yeah, so that transition makes up a huge part of the book, and for good reason. There are a step-by-step process. It began with, so Morris Dees, who's the co-founder, felt compunction and remorse about not getting involved actively in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So in the 1970s, he founded the Southern Poverty Law Center, which did a lot of good work on specific cases, on changing the way that redistricting worked in Alabama. You had the first Black representatives finally win since Reconstruction and be able to represent the community a little bit. So you had some real progress at first, but then Morris Dees took the organization in two directions. First, he was very liberal from the get-go, and he actually went and worked on the George McGovern campaign in 1972 and brought a whole bunch of those very far left donors into the SPLC's donor base and was able to grow the SPLC that way. And then he also had this long-term, the Ku Klux Klan is a horrific hate group in America's past, and still a little bit around today, although not much. Morris Dees had a personal history with the Klan. He had represented a Klan member in the 1960s, and he had Klan members in his family. And he eventually had a strong animus against the Klan, not just, as a hate group, but also personally himself. At one point, he sat a Klan member across the room from him and pulled out a shotgun and put it in his face. And he mentions this in his autobiography. He's very proud of it. Anyway, he decided to take the SPLC in an anti-Klan direction, shooting to bankrupt hate groups like the Klan. And this is the kind of work that started to make even other people at the SPLC a little nervous, because they had signed up, a lot of the lawyers, to help poor people in these particular cases that the SPLC had done so well.
Poor people that were both white and Black. And
exactly.
Yeah.
In some cases, actually, there was a reverse discrimination case that the SPLC took up in its early years. So the SPLC was not just a liberal group at first, but Dees took it in that direction. And in 1968, the entire legal staff resigned en masse because Dees had made the KKK the central mission of the SPLC. And the SPLC had this internal revolt where they said, no, we don't exist just to fight the Ku Klux Klan. We exist to help people in the South. And so they left, and Dees continued the group in that direction. He eventually, he painted himself in the fundraising literature as this David fighting Goliath, slaying these grand dragons, when in reality, they didn't have much money to begin with. These Klan groups in the 1980s were really starting to fall apart. They were able to carry out a few horrific lynchings, which they rightly were dragged into court for, and Dees shut them down. But at the time, these groups didn't have a lot of money. So when Dees bankrupted them, they, lost about $50,000 they had to their name. And Dees went to his donors and said, "Hey, look, I got this multi-million-dollar settlement against this horrible hate group. Won't you pony up cash?" Dees raked in the millions and millions for the SPLC, whereas these small groups that he could go to his donors and say, "Hey, I'm destroying the evil hate groups." They only had about $50,000. In one case, a black mother whose son had been lynched in one of these cases.
Beulah May Donald.
Yes, exactly. Beulah May Donald. She lost her son, and the SPLC sued the group that had orchestrated the lynching against him. That group had about $50,000 that they forked over. And of course, in court, the settlement was all of your assets. It was a multi-million-dollar settlement, but they didn't have millions of dollars. They had 50,000. So they gave the 50,000 to Beulah May Donald, and she turned around and gave the money to the SPLC, who had given her a loan so that she could live in a house for that time. So you get this horrendous disparity between this woman who, was the real victim in the case, and she got the money, but it was a pittance. And the SPLC goes to its donors and says, "Pony up cash," rakes in millions of dollars to keep its system going, and the real victim is left out in the cold. She even wanted to do a fundraising, she even wanted to do a video to tell her story. And the SPLC, Morris Dees at the time, was also working on a video. Dees's video kept her video from being made. And so the Beulah May Donald story never happened. And the Dees story, which continued to draw attention, fundraising, etc., to the SPLC, did. And in recent years, since in the 1980s, they had these huge successes getting rid of these hate groups. But, that wasn't enough. They needed fresh fields to conquer. So they started moving progressively more and more mainstream in the organizations they slandered as hate groups, comparing them to the KKK. And eventually, they went to groups as mainstream as Alliance Defending Freedom, Family Research Council, Act for America, and even in some cases, Muslim reformers who are warning about the threat of radical Islamic terrorism and the way that Islam has been weaponized into terrorist violence. So the SPLC has become, to some degree, an organization that silences people in the same way that it fought against them being silenced in the South in its early years.
Right, and they've even put on, I'm looking through the list now, and I think they're headlining some of the more, I guess, marketable hate groups that marketable meaning they can raise money using them. So in American College of Pediatricians goes on there because they're sort of an alternative group that talks about homosexuality and pedophilia and things like that. And going back to what you were talking about with Klan Watch, reading, because I'm also writing some stuff long term about that period with the Donald case, that people don't understand that already in the 60s, the Klan was not the Klan. It was really, there were regional groups, there was different national organizations that had become completely fractured because, there's just people, they also, some of them were more into some of the business aspects of being a hate group, which obviously today would probably be very unprofitable. So the idea that he wrecked the Klan is simply, it's incorrect in every sense of the word. Let's switch to the video. I know that I sent you it. This was Mo Dees talking about his motivation for actually forming the SPLC. So I'm gonna hit play.
Welcome, Mr. Dees.
Mike, glad to be here.
Welcome,
Thank
Mr.
you for
Dees.
having me.
Mike, glad to be here. I just wanted to start off by asking you about your personal motivation to do the work that you do. I know you have a really interesting story about how you decided to get into this line of work.
Well, I'm not sure if there's any story that singularly describes why a person does what they do. But, you know, I grew up on a small cotton farm in Alabama. My family didn't own any land. They finally got a little piece before my dad died. I worked in the cotton fields alongside blacks, few poor whites like we did, and I had a chance to see firsthand some of the discrimination. At a time when I was in high school in the 1950s, Brown versus Board came down. And you kind of had to make a decision which way are you going to go. I went to college, studied law, came back to practice law, and found that most of the clients asked me to represent them since I didn't have any connections with the rich people in the businesses Montgomery, Alabama. Black people that I grew up with, and a few poor whites.
In order to represent them, I had to kind of go against the establishment in many cases. All right, so you heard that, and in the book you actually describe the fact that he did actually represent clients that were. There was a client that was a Klan member. He also, in a certain sense, I think he was active on a campaign for a candidate who was segregationist, like after Brown versus Board. Okay, how about you tell us how true was Mo Dees' statement of why he formed the SPLC?
Yeah, so that, I mean, I haven't watched that whole interview, but he certainly skips over a lot of things that he actually wrote in his autobiography. He did represent a Klan member. It's funny to hear him say it like that. You kind of get the sense that he had always been on the side of the white, and in actuality, he wasn't. I mean, he's an interesting figure because he did get in trouble with his local church. He took a stance. He was a Bible study leader, and he took a stance for one of these civil rights cases, and then he got shut down pretty quickly. So, you know, he does have that small step on his record. But the bigger situation was when, you know, you had the Freedom Riders. And during the Freedom Ride riot in, I believe it was in Montgomery, there was this man who beat up Black Freedom Riders. So, you know, pretty open and shut, like, oh, if you are a civil rights champion, you should be on the side of the Freedom Riders, the Black guys who were beaten up. In this case, the Klansmen who beat up the Freedom Riders went to Morris Dees and asked him to represent him.
Right, which is his right, but it's against Mo Dees' account. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, go ahead.
It's like these people like that deserve representation. You know, even if you're on the wrong side of a case. You know, I think recently we had in the Me Too situation. I don't remember. I think it was Weinstein.
Yeah, with the professor from Harvard.
Exactly, a Harvard law professor who decided to represent him, and you know that's a very representable. That's a very admirable position to, you know, go and fight. You know, give representation to somebody who is almost certainly guilty. You know, who is horrible in the public light, but still deserves the right to be represented. And that's one of the things the Southern Poverty Law Center originally stood for, was representing people. Everybody deserves legal representation. And so the SPLC started for that purpose. It is funny to see Dees totally going over, you know, not mentioning at all his family connections with the Klan. He talks in his book about his uncle who actually bragged about ripping off Black people in stores, like saying, oh yeah, if I see a Black guy come in, I'm going to have a separate section of my store and I'm going to have less goods in the sacks of flour that they're going to pay full price for. It's like,
oh yeah, I think I heard this story.
Yeah, it's disgusting. And Dees was outraged by that, as well he should have been. But it's interesting because his story is not black and white. He represented a Klansman. He wanted the civil rights movement to succeed, but he didn't get involved in the 1960s. And that's actually why he founded the SPLC in the first place, was almost to atone for, the fact that he hadn't stood up when it really mattered.
So you have this passive bystander during the 1960s. Nowadays, there's demonstrators walking in the streets saying that silence is violence, and talking about, white feminists being a problem for minority groups concerning the Amy Cooper situation, which I'm sure your media corporation has covered. I think like really we're talking about, behavior auditing in society, which I think we'll get to a couple questions about that, but it's very ironic given Dee's own history there. You did go through a little bit about him having to resign. So in chapter 2, you explored in depth the unseen history of Mo Dees, and this included his naked attempts to use litigation for fundraising, defending members of the Klan and his clients, which we went over, and his numerous sexual indiscretions that led to a half dozen divorces. This, of course, led to the resignations of Dees, Richard, among other things, Richard Cohn, and several other higher-ups. Why, however, did the SPLC and former employees never sue him or the organization for that behavior during all those years?
Well, I think they wanted to brush it under the rug. Even the SPLC employees, who were rightly horrified about Morris Dees' history, did not want to continue to weaken their organization by dragging out the story. And I think you see this almost terrifying, double standard that a lot of liberal politicians and groups have when, Brett Kavanaugh is accused of sexual assault, and by an extremely flimsy accusation, they're all saying, believe women, believe women, believe women, when Joe Biden has a much more credible accusation brought against him, still questionable, mind you. Biden is not necessarily guilty, but, then they're like, oh, let's brush that under the rug. You have Gretchen Whitmer going up there saying, oh, it pains me that I have to deal with this situation. It's like Gretchen Whitmer, who was on the line yelling at Brett Kavanaugh, is saying, oh no, this dredges up horrible memories. I don't want to have to talk about this when it comes to Joe Biden. So for partially that reason, the SPLC, when it fired Dees, when Cohen stepped down, when the entire leadership was pushed out, they announced that they would do an internal review, an investigation. And to this day, no results have been published. And in fact, actually, it might have been 2 months, but shortly after Dees was fired, Cohen was let go, you had these claims, based in decades of history of racial discrimination and sexual harassment, things that, should get talked about and should really seriously encourage an organization to reform itself.
Especially a legal organization.
Right? And especially in the age of Me Too, they brushed under the rug, and their interim president goes out and says, oh, the SPLC is like the Underground Railroad. Totally forgetting the fact that it had been that former black employees had called the SPLC a plantation. No, it's the Underground Railroad. We're saving people from hate and violence.
I think like what really like the public, I think, really ignores this. Sort of people like who write more about it, like yourself, like me, that it's becoming obvious that some of these nonprofits, they just seem to have, 9 lives, and they can't. I remember when Acorn got wrecked, but that's like a huge exception, because normally they're just able to, do a little PR emergency surgery and work it out. And that's why I want to, my next question actually directly addresses that. It looked like not long ago that the Majid Nawaz case and other episodes of bad publicity would wreck the SPLC's reputation. Last year, though, that Chick-fil-A donated $2,500 to the SPLC and also donated to them in 2017. With the recent unrest, Pornhub has promised to donate $100,000 to organizations that fight, quote, racism and social injustice, including the SPLC. Babbel and other organizations, corporations have started employee donation matching funds for the group. The organization seems to have gotten a new lease on life. What do you think can be done after this setback for those attempting to shed light on the SPLC's real nature?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote the book to hold them accountable to this. We saw, it baffles my mind just how much mainstream media, like the New York Times, has seemed to have forgotten the scandal that wrecked the SPLC. They seem to have entirely moved on. And they, just last year, the New York Times, the Miami Herald, and the Palm Beach Post all ran SPLC and Council on American Islamic Relations talking points, slamming Act for America as a hate group. And they actually forced even Mar-a-Lago, even the Trump organization, to cancel an event with Act for America. It baffles my mind. It's like, right. You guys know, the organization you're citing for this not only had a racial discrimination and sexual harassment scandal, but former employees came forward and said that the hate group accusation is itself a fundraising scam to raise money, to making hate pay. The title of my book comes from in January. They testified before Congress, and they said that big tech and the government need to shut down hate groups and silence them because they are statistically connected to white supremacist terrorism. I mean, they acted as though their hate group list, which has a million problems, and it goes through all sorts of different hate groups. It accuses, conservative Christian groups of being anti-LGBT. It accuses national security groups of being anti-Muslim. It accuses groups of being anti-immigrant. And yet none of those groups is necessarily connected in any way to racism or white nationalism or white supremacy. But the SPLC testifies before Congress saying all the hate groups are somehow proof that white supremacist terrorism is increasing in the United States, tying it.
And I think a great example I just pulled up on the screen for the viewers, they have the Remembrance Project up, founded by Maria Espinosa, which talks about victims of illegal immigrant crime. And they're calling it, first of all, extremist group automatically. And, all they're doing is basically saying, well, if you have an objection to people coming in here and, first of all, bringing in drugs, bringing in prostitutes, bringing in child prostitutes too, you might be a hate group, like the Jeff Foxworthy line. It's just ridiculous. And this is a, Mexican American woman who founded this organization. And I think people, it's ridiculous. That was just one example. A lot of the organizations they put on it are legal aid societies that are the exact same category as the SPLC. It's like almost like they're trying to both limit criticism and, so to speak, competition, even though they're not competing for the same clientele.
Yeah. Well, I think of it as an orchestrated campaign to demonize dissent, to silence voices that disagree with them. But, it's partially that. It's partially draining other groups of resources. And then, there is the big fundraising aspect of it. A lot of these organizations, Act for America disbanded its chapters 2 years ago. And yet the SPLC continues to list, I believe the last count was 30-something chapters of Act for America, even though they're just a national organization. So the SPLC is intentionally inflating the numbers of hate groups, not just by accusing groups that aren't hateful of being hate groups, but also by listing defunct organizations that barely exist. One of the biggest ones that got me scratching my head was this Confederate Memorabilia shop.
Yeah, that was great in the book. I love that. In was it somewhere in Georgia, like Kennesaw, Georgia? Yeah, go ahead, explain that one.
Yeah, exactly. Kennesaw, Georgia. They've taken it down now, of course. Well, I shouldn't say of course, but I think that one shamed them enough that they decided, okay, we're going to take it down. But this Confederate Memorabilia shop, run by one guy who was like selling stuff, and the SPLC brands him a hate group, and then they send a reporter, and the reporter goes to Kennesaw, Georgia, and talks to people, and is like, oh, so this guy's considered a member of the community. He was in a play 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Georgia embraces hate.
I think if that's a standard to set, I mean, there's parts of, my city and especially like in Boston, for example, if you go to like an old like pub where like you have like older Irish people there, and they're, if you listen to conversations there where people say what they really feel about the current trends, that pub could be defined as a hate group because people, I mean, a Confederate memorabilia store, I don't really care either. I think, but to think that it requires a massive nonprofit with hundreds of millions of dollars on their IRS tax forms, which I did look through, and I'm sure you did too, is just kind of it shows that it's actually the David and Goliath thing is flipped, and now you have people who maybe their views aren't great, but they have no social and societal power, being on the receiving end of this criticism from the rest of society. In chapter 7, so this is along the same lines, you focus on the impact of Charlottesville, excuse me, on the free speech discussion and the growing movement to rename schools and institutions that have Confederate roots. This has morphed and mutated such that even Penny Lane, the Liverpool road made famous by the Beatles song, may be renamed for its association with the slave trader. Will the SPLC, in your opinion, begin to press the issue further now and sue localities that refuse to rename their institutions?
That's a great question. I think the answer is yes. I would predict. So the SPLC is smart. They're not going to just sue over something like Penny Lane. But I think after you've seen these attacks, it's funny. The SPLC not only has, so they have this hate map, which plots these hate groups. And there was a terrorist attack. A would-be murderer found the hate map and targeted a group on the hate map because of the hate map. And he testified in court that was why he targeted them. Similarly, this
Family
Confederate
Research Center, was that the one?
Yeah, the Family Research Council. And I think that's chapter 6 of my book. But the SPLC came out with another map, a hate map for Confederate monuments. And they said that these monuments, the existence of these monuments, has the potential to unleash turmoil and bloodshed, citing Charlottesville. Now, some of these monuments on this Confederate hate map are schools, middle schools, elementary schools, high schools, military bases. In one case, it was called Stonewall Elementary. Stonewall Elementary was not named after Stonewall Jackson. It was named after a literal stone wall that was built there. And if the SPLC had done a little bit of digging, they would have found that they were falsely accusing a school of being a Confederate symbol, rallying, turmoil and bloodshed. And this kind of thing, this is malicious, and I would argue it's defamation. I have a whole bunch of, I list 10 cases in the back of the book. Many of those cases are ongoing. A few of them, like you said, Majid Nawaz, which is a tremendous story.
Right. Who's not
needs to get more attention. A Muslim reformer who the SPLC branded yeah, as anti-Muslim extremists. But to get back to your question on Confederate symbols, Confederate monuments, names of things, the SPLC would not just come with a lawsuit out of the blue. They would find some black person who claims to feel the pain of this monument existing and then sue on their behalf. And the problem, one of the problems with people like Governor Ralph Northam going out there and taking down these statues is that a lot of the rhetoric enables the SPLC to have a legal case to do this kind of thing. And I'm not pro Confederacy. I mean, some people have actually attacked me for attacking the Confederacy in the book. I side with Lincoln. I think they were an insurrection, a rebellion that was rightly put down. But the problem is the Confederacy does not mean the same thing to everyone. And a lot of these, like the bases, the military bases that have Confederate names, they were given those names in an effort to bring the North and South together, in an effort for peace. And if you look at what the Confederate flag means in the South today and across the country, it is a symbol of Southern pride. It no longer stands for white supremacy or slavery in the way that the SPLC suggests that it does. So the SPLC is aggravating a situation that need not be aggravated. And it's arguable. And I mean, Carol Swain, who is a black professor who actually has been cited by the Supreme Court in her discussions on race, she has said that the SPLC is inflaming racial passions that are bad for the black community as well as for white people across this country. But she told me that Charlottesville might never have happened if the SPLC had not pushed this agenda. And now we're seeing Antifa rioters destroying statues of all kinds, destroying Winston Churchill, the original anti-fascist, destroying
Gandhi.
a statue for the black veteran, for the black volunteers and the Union Army. It's like, guys.
Yeah, and I think it's clear that me and you have sort of the same stances. I mean, I don't really care about the Confederacy as, some people have the lost cause mentality that you were bringing up in the book, which I think is sort of, it's just a historical argument. I don't think people should really make such a big deal out of it. But it is coming up because Bubba Wallace this week said that he doesn't want to see the Confederate flag anymore at NASCAR speedways. Bubba Wallace, of course, the first black NASCAR driver since 1970. And I think it's really the media, amplification. There's always a person who is the tip of the spear. In this case, it's Bubba Wallace. Sometimes it's people in any case, the SPLC is there as one of the arms to support that enforcement. And then when they have these ridiculously pliant public officials, like the ones in Seattle, like Governor Northam, Governor Beshear in Kentucky, here in Ohio even, I think this was something, I sometimes write for another YouTuber named Anthony Logan. Our governor went along with a declaration by the Franklin County commissioner over where Columbus is, and he caved. Our Republican governor, DeWine, said that, racism is a public health crisis. It's like, no, it's racism is, I mean, can we separate, I think it's really getting into the realm of politicizing every single aspect of society when you start to talk about public health, which should be about, of course, issues of, mitigating infectious disease, which is more relevant than ever, even if you debate it. But then they inject politics into it. And, do you think the SPLC will get into issues of like medical ethics and ideas like what's been going on overseas regarding aborting, children that have disabilities, like has happened in Iceland? Do you think that they will start taking up cases like that, defending?
So the SPLC,
Yeah, go ahead. Hello?
yeah, the SPLC has been a fellow traveler with the abortion movement for a while. Uh, as I document in the book, they brought one of the longest termed cases against a pro-life activist in American history that went to the Supreme Court twice. But it's very interesting because they're selective about how they silence people and how they act on these cases. They will bring up a case and weaponize it. So, like in New Jersey, they shut down a Jewish nonprofit because the Jewish nonprofit was originally referring some patients to therapists who would give them therapy for unwanted same-sex attraction.
Oh, you're talking
And
about the Jonah Project.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. These are mainstream. Like it, there's this conversion therapy is the term that people use to demonize any therapy that might help people with unwanted same-sex attraction. This is very, they follow mainstream practices. They're patient-driven, and it's important, to condemn the previous excesses of this kind of therapy. But the therapy that exists now adheres to standards that are shared across the board. And there's this increasing double standard of if you have same-sex attraction and you like it, you identify with it, you can get therapy for other problems that affirms your position. And that's one of the things therapy should exist to do. But if you have same-sex attraction and you don't want it, then there are, New Jersey has defined its law as silencing anyone who would refer someone to that kind of therapy. And it's insane. But they shut down this Jewish nonprofit for this reason. And then the guy founded another nonprofit and a conservative crowdfunding site called Funding Morality that funded a broad array of things and was essentially just a platform. And the New Jersey court went after and shut that down too and gave him an extra fine. And all of this was at the instigation of the Southern Poverty Law Center. So when the Southern Poverty Law Center finds someone that it wants to make an example out of, that it wants to destroy, that it wants to, and in this case, it wanted to create a nationwide precedent so that eventually all conversion therapy could be silenced. And this thing, it's a growing nationwide trend. You had in California a similar bill. I shouldn't go into it too much. But in response to your question, the SPLC probably will take up an abortion case, but it would be an abortion case that is tangentially related to some other issues and that would not be the major one. So I haven't checked. I don't think they've written briefs in the main abortion case at the Supreme Court right now, but they will. I mean, it's very likely that they will get involved in abortion cases selectively where they think they can make a difference going forward.
All right. Yeah. I think it's going to be very troubling because obviously I thought, for example, the SPLC had lost a lot of its momentum after the Nawaz case. I thought that corporate America was finally realizing that you don't really gain anything by working with these people. It's almost like just paying extortion. It is paying extortion money to people that are much less fashionable than John Gotti. They're like a legal counterpart to it. So yeah, thanks again. I know that you're limited on time. I'd love to talk to you a different time, maybe offline about some of the work I do. One last note, I think the Stonewall Democrats might have to change their name to the Stonewall Not Jackson Democrats. It's unbecoming of a tolerant and loving organization to be affiliated with this awful, awful dude from, I think, wasn't he from Tennessee or something? Stonewall Jackson. Yeah, it's unbecoming. They have to get with the times. It's 2020, Stonewall Democrats. Just change your name.
How dare you apply the standard equally? I mean, come on.
Yeah. I mean,
Tolerance for one side only.
there's no other way that you could take the word Stonewall, right? I mean, I'm joking, of course. That was named after the Stonewall Inn, but in any case, I want to thank Tyler again, Tyler O'Neill. The book he has it behind him. I put a link to the Barnes and Noble listing, but I think it's only for the ebook. So if you want a hard copy, I think it's on Amazon or perhaps on Google Shop. But I liked it a lot, and I'm actually working on some related material long term about a lot of these groups, including the SPLC. So thanks again, and hopefully we'll see some good news, although it doesn't look very positive to me.
Yeah, we've just got to keep hammering it on. It's why I wrote the book. It's why, I'm very glad to speak with people like you. We're going to raise the issue again and again, and whatever we have to do to get people to realize that groups like this are not reliable, that big tech, that corporate America, that the media should not be at their beck and call, we need to do. So get the book, read American Greatness, read PJ Media, and
have they tried going after PJ Media yet?
Not that I know of. And it's funny. I've talked with some lawyers about if they were to go after me personally, and people are saying, "Oh yeah, if they go after you personally, that's your best day. You can, bring it to discovery. You can do a lot of research, and it draws more attention to the book." So I think what the SPLC is probably trying to do is to make sure that my book doesn't get attention, because it tells the truth about them, and they don't want that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think certainly it's obviously it would be better if there were more available ways to discuss this information, more marketable ways, but it's definitely, it's very authoritative. You go through a lot of the stuff from the Montgomery Advertiser, which I was reading before I picked this up. So thanks again, and I'll try to contact you later about some other stuff. And in the chat, I don't think I see any. Oh, somebody asked whatever happened to the head of the SPLC and the sexual harassment charges made against him last year. Well, didn't he quit or something? And then it sort of fell off it's not their responsibility.
Ease is the one whose discretions are most public. There have been a little bit of concerns, I think, about Richard Cohen, but not public. Neither of them have been gone after legally. So to answer the question, yeah, it's no. A lot of the stuff that I'm familiar with would be outside of the statute of limitations. So it's questionable as to whether or not they could be liable. But yeah, that's a great question, and I think they've tried to brush everything under the rug as much as they can.
Right, yeah, which is, that's the same thing as NBC and all those other organizations did concerning Lauer and Weinstein and all that. So anyway, everybody have a great day. Make sure to either pick up the book or the ebook, and I'll let you know, Tyler, when I have the synopsis, and then we'll have it published.
Great.
All right, have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye. All right, so you're going to see me disappear real quick. That again was Tyler O'Neill, and we're just going to keep interviewing a lot of these authors, seeing, of course, a lot of this literature coming out, talking about the real nature of nonprofit organizations and the way that they use these political issues in order to enrich themselves. And yeah, I hope to speak to you guys again soon. I know that there was the live stream yesterday that was cut off a little early because I had to go do something outside. So I might reschedule that today. depending on how much I really have any motivation for that, to be honest with you. But please like, share, and subscribe. You can also find me on all of these other media: YouTube, BitChute, Minds.com, Subscribestar, Gab, and Library. Make sure